I'd been renting this cheap place near the state forest for about 3 years. It wasn't much to look at, but I liked that I could just hop in the car and be at the trailhead in 10 minutes. I went out there a lot, mostly just to clear my head or get some exercise without having to deal with a gym. It was usually pretty empty, which I preferred, and I'd gotten used to having the woods to myself. On this specific Tuesday, I didn't have to work until later in the afternoon, so I figured I'd head out early and get a few miles in before the day got hot. I drove down to the parking lot around 8:30, parked my car, and started walking down one of the side paths I knew pretty well. I wasn't really paying attention to anything, just kind of zoning out and walking, when I came around a bend and saw something that made me stop dead in my tracks. Right in the middle of a small clearing up ahead, there was someone sitting against a fallen log. They were facing the other way, wearing a heavy winter coat and a wool hat, which was weird, because it wasn't even that cold out. I stood there for a second just watching them. I was maybe 50 feet away. It felt off because usually hikers wave or nod, but this person was perfectly still, like statue still. I looked around the rest of the clearing to see if anyone else was there, but it was just trees and brush. I didn't get a scary vibe. I mostly just thought it was strange. I figured maybe they were hurt, or maybe just taking a really deep nap. But I stood there for another minute and they didn't move an inch, and I even scuffed my boots on the ground to make some noise. But they didn't react at all. I decided I should probably check on them, just to be safe. I walked a little closer, moving slow, and that's when I noticed something else on the ground. There were drag marks in the dirt, deep lines, like something heavy had been pulled through the leaves, right up to where the person was sitting. I probably should have turned around right then, but I guess I just wanted to make sure they weren't dead or something. I walked up to the log, staying a bit to the side. As I got closer, though, the shape of the person looked wrong. The shoulders were too square and the head was tilting at a weird angle. I got right up to it and realized it wasn't a person at all. It was my own spare winter coat that I kept in the back seat of my car, stuffed full of pine needles and leaves to fill it out. The second I recognized the coat, my stomach dropped. Someone had to have broken into my car, taken this and hiked out here ahead of me just to set this up. It meant they were watching me the whole time. I spun around, scanning the tree line, but I couldn't see anything past the thick brush. I reached into my pocket to grab my keys and get the hell out of there. But my pocket was empty. I patted my other pockets, but they were empty too. I felt a cold sweat break out all over me. I knew I had them when I locked the car. Whoever did this must have picked my pocket or grabbed them when I stopped to tie my shoe earlier, and I was so zoned out I didn't even feel it. I felt totally exposed, standing there in the open. I didn't have a phone, didn't have keys, and I was a mile into the woods with someone messing with me. I needed to get back to the main road where I might see a passing car. I started backing away from the dummy, trying to keep quiet, when I heard a branch snap loud and clear directly behind me. It was heavy footsteps. I just turned and sprinted. I ran full speed back down the trail, tripping over roots and almost wiping out a couple of times. I could hear the person running behind me, crashing through the brush. They weren't trying to be quiet anymore. They were chasing me. I ran until my lungs were burning, not stopping until I burst out of the woods and onto the paved road. I saw a delivery van coming down the hill, and I basically jumped in front of it, waving my arms. The driver slammed on his brakes and stopped just in time. I scrambled into the passenger side before he could even ask what was wrong, locking the door the second I was inside. My heart was pounding so hard I could barely talk to tell him to drive. We went straight to the police station in town. I sat there for hours, just shaking, waiting for them to go check it out. I kept thinking about how the guy was close enough to take my keys without me knowing. When the officers came back, they told me they found my car still in the lot. It hadn't been stolen, but the doors were wide open, and the glove box was ripped out. They found the coat on the log too, but the guy was gone. It's been a few weeks and they still haven't found who it was. It messes with my head knowing that someone was watching me that closely, and I had no clue. I moved out of that rental house a few days later because I couldn't sleep knowing he might know where I live. I don't think I'll ever go hiking alone again. This happened about a year ago. I was 26 at the time. I'd gotten really into hiking during the weekends, mostly just to get out of the apartment and clear my head from work. The problem was that all the public parks and state trails were getting insanely crowded, which kind of defeated the purpose of going out to nature. So I started looking for alternatives and found this timber company online that sold recreational access permits. Basically, you pay a yearly fee and they give you a key to the gates on their private logging roads, so you can hike or hunt on thousands of acres of land where nobody else is allowed. It sounded perfect, so I bought the pass and was pretty excited to finally have a place to myself. I planned my first trip for a Saturday morning. The land was about 2 hours away, deep in the foothills, where cell service was spotty at best. When I arrived at the main access gate, the first thing I noticed was just how desolate it was. It wasn't like a park entrance with a ranger station or maps. It was just a heavy yellow steel gate off a gravel road, with a bunch of signs plastered all over it. I unlocked it, drove through and locked it behind me like the instructions said. I drove another 3 miles down this rough logging road until I found the trailhead, marked on the map they sent me. I parked the car, and when I shut the engine off, the silence was heavy. It was dead silent. No highway noise, no other cars, just the wind in the tops of the fir trees. Anyway, I grabbed my pack and started walking. The trail was really just an overgrown logging skid road that hadn't been used by trucks in years. It was nice though. I walked for probably an hour and didn't see a single soul. According to the paper map I had, the trail was supposed to loop around a ridge and come back down to the main road. I was making good time and feeling pretty good about the purchase. About halfway through the loop, the trail came to a fork that wasn't on the map. The main path seemed to continue straight, but it was blocked by a large metal gate with a heavy chain and a shiny padlock on it. It looked weird, because the map showed the loop continuing straight right where the gate was, and there were no signs on it. Right next to the gate, maybe 20 feet off the trail in a small clearing, there was an old hunting blind. It was just a wooden box built on top of stilts, maybe 10 or 12 feet in the air. The plywood was gray and peeling, and the little window slits were dark. It gave me a weird vibe, just because it was looming right over the trail. But I figured it was just part of the property, since I was stuck and didn't want to turn around and hike 3 miles back the way I came. I decided to text the number on my permit. The permit card had a land manager number on it for emergencies or lock issues. I pulled out my phone and surprisingly had 1 bar of service. So I sent a text explaining that I was a permit holder and if there was a code for the locked gate blocking the trail. I stood there waiting, leaning against the locked gate. It was super quiet. The wind had died down, so there wasn't even the sound of the trees moving. I just stared at that old hunting blind while I waited. It was so close I could see the grain on the plywood. About 2 minutes later, my phone buzzed. It was the land manager. He texted back saying he was currently out of state in Montana, visiting family, but that there shouldn't be a lock there, and the crews were supposed to leave it open. He asked if I was sure I was on the right trail. I looked at the map again and texted back telling him I was definitely in the right spot, standing right in front of the gate. I mentioned it had a fresh silver padlock on it. He replied almost instantly saying that was impossible, because he was just there last week before he flew out, and it was open. He suggested I try pulling on the chain harder, because it gets stuck sometimes. I felt a little annoyed because I wasn't an idiot, and knew how a lock worked. I grabbed the chain and shook it against the metal gate just to be sure, but it was locked tight. I texted him back again, insisting it was locked and I couldn't get through. I waited again. The silence of the woods seemed to rush back in, after I stopped making noise. I kept glancing at the hunting blind. I don't know why, but I had this sudden urge to be quiet. The phone buzzed again with a message saying he didn't know what to tell me and that I must be at the wrong gate, telling me to just turn around. This text really weirded me out because it felt dismissive, almost like he was gaslighting me into thinking I was lost just so I would leave. But I knew I wasn't lost. I decided to prove it to him. I opened my camera app and took a picture of the gate with the padlock clearly visible. Then I walked over near the side of the trail to get a better angle that showed the hunting blind in the background, just to prove exactly where I was. I sent the photo with a text saying I wasn't lost. I watched the phone screen as the photo uploaded. It took a few seconds because of the bad signal. I was standing maybe 15 feet from the base of the hunting blind, right in the dirt. The woods were dead silent. Then, the message status changed to delivered. And immediately, less than a second later, I heard a loud phone notification sound coming from inside the hunting blind. I froze, staring at the dark slit of the window on the blind. The sound had been unmistakable. The land manager was sitting in that box, 10 feet above me, and he had just gotten the picture I sent. I just turned around and ran. I sprinted back down the trail harder than I have ever run in my life. I was stumbling over rocks and roots, but I didn't slow down. I ran for probably 20 minutes straight before I even slowed down to catch my breath. And even then, I kept checking behind me. I made it back to the car and drove way too fast back to the main gate, unlocked it, and got onto the county road. I eventually called the sheriff's department the next day. I told them about the permit and the guy lying about where he was. They sent a deputy out to check it out. A few days later, the deputy called me back. He said they went to the location I described, but the gate was wide open and the padlock was gone. They checked the hunting blind and it was empty. They tried to call the land manager's number, but it was disconnected. So I don't know who was in that blind. I don't know if it was the actual guy or someone else who had access to the number, but I know he was watching me from that dark window, holding his phone. I haven't been hiking since. This was last summer. I'd been working crazy hours at my tech job in Seattle and just hit a wall where I needed to disconnect from everything. I wasn't looking for a fancy resort or anything. Really just needed some silence and fresh air. So, I started looking at the Forest Service rentals and found this fire lookout tower way out in the Cascades. It was kind of a miracle that I even found it, because these places usually book up 6 months in advance. But I guess someone had canceled last minute for a night. So I snagged it immediately. It was pretty far out there, not near any major campgrounds or tourist spots. But the isolation was exactly what I wanted. I left early in the morning because the drive was about 4 hours, and then I still had the hike to do. The section of the national forest I was heading to was rugged and covered in thick Douglas firs. Not a lot of other cars on the service road, except for the occasional logging truck. After a while of bouncing down this gravel road, I finally made it to the trailhead. There were no other cars parked there, which I took as a good sign. I threw my pack on, locked the car, and started hiking. The trail was brutal. It was only 5 miles, but it was basically straight up the side of the mountain with endless switchbacks. I hiked slowly and carefully for the entire afternoon, stopping a lot to drink water and just catch my breath. By the time I broke through the tree line and saw the tower, the sun was already starting to dip toward the horizon. And on first glance, the lookout looked way taller than I expected. It stood on a rocky peak, with a massive drop-off on all sides, so it felt really exposed. I walked up to the base of the tower. The whole valley below was filling up with shadows, and the wind was really whipping around the metal legs of the structure. I could hear the cables humming and creaking as the gusts hit them. I headed up the steep wooden stairs, gripping the railing tight because I'm not great with heights. I got all the way to the top, expecting to just unlock the trap door and flop down on the bed. I pushed the heavy wooden panel up with my shoulder and froze, because there was a pair of dirty work boots standing right on the edge of the opening. "Whoa, easy there," a voice said from above me. I almost fell backward down the stairs. I scrambled up onto the deck to see a guy kneeling on the floor of the cabin, holding a screwdriver. He looked to be in his 50s, wearing a faded green vest and heavy canvas pants. He didn't smile. He just looked kind of surprised to see me, wiping grease onto a rag. I was out of breath and confused, asking him who he was. He explained calmly that he was a volunteer with the Forest Service, just finishing up some repairs on the propane stove valve. He said he hadn't realized someone had rented the place for tonight, or he would have cleared out sooner. He seemed annoyed with himself, checking his watch and muttering about the time. He packed up his tools into a canvas bag pretty quickly. I felt bad because it was getting dark, so I told him he didn't have to rush off if he needed a minute. But he shook his head and said he had his truck parked down at the lower logging road, which was a shorter hike than the main trail. He said he'd just use his headlamp and be down in an hour. He zipped up his bag, nodded at me, and stepped onto the catwalk. I watched him climb down the stairs until his silhouette disappeared into the dark tree line below. I waited until I couldn't see him anymore. Then I went back inside, closed the heavy trapdoor, and threw the deadbolt. I really wasn't comfortable with being so far out in the wilderness after running into a stranger like that. But he seemed legitimate. And the only reason I decided to stay and not hike back down immediately is because my legs were jelly and it was pitch black outside now. I tried to not overthink it. I walked over and checked the latch on the door to the catwalk. It was locked tight. The 360-degree view was beautiful, but as the sun vanished, the glass just turned into black mirrors, reflecting the inside of the cabin. It felt like being in a fishbowl where anything outside could see in, but I couldn't see out. I stayed away from the windows for about 30 minutes, staying on my phone and just trying to distract myself. I had downloaded a book to read, so I sat at the table and tried to focus. I could hear the muffled sound of the wind howling around the eaves, and so eventually, I felt good enough to start getting ready for bed. I was exhausted from the hike and just wanted to sleep. I set my phone on the map table, brushed my teeth using my water bottle, and then went over to the bunk. It was one of those old wooden platforms, built directly into the wall to save space. The mattress looked fairly new, though, and I threw my sleeping bag on top of it. I climbed in and turned off my lantern. The room went pitch black, aside from the faint starlight coming through the windows. I lay there for a while, just listening to the wind buffering the tower. But after about 10 minutes, the wind died down for a second. The cabin got completely silent, and in that silence, I felt something strange. It was a tiny vibration, not a sound, but a feeling. It felt like something had tapped the underside of the plywood I was laying on. I stopped breathing to listen. I stared up at the dark ceiling, my heart starting to pick up a little. I told myself it was just the building settling. Old wood expands, and contracts in the cold. It made sense. I tried to close my eyes and force myself to relax. I shifted my legs to get comfortable, and the plywood creaked loudly under my weight. I froze again, waiting for the sound to stop echoing, but the echo didn't stop. It was followed by a sound that shouldn't have been there. It was the faint, wet sound of fabric rubbing against wood. It was so quiet I almost missed it, but it came from directly underneath my hip. I lay there, staring into the dark. My brain started racing, trying to figure out what was under the bunk. I realized it wasn't just a platform, it was a box, a built-in storage unit with a cabinet door on the front that I hadn't checked. I held my breath, straining my ears. The silence stretched out for 10 seconds. Then I heard it. It was a slow, controlled exhale. The sound was unmistakably human. It was the sound of someone trying desperately to breathe quietly in a dusty space. and it was less than 3 inches from my ear, separated only by a sheet of plywood and a thin mattress. The realization hit me so hard I felt nauseous. The volunteer, he hadn't hiked down. He had walked down the stairs until he was out of sight, waited for me to go inside, and then climbed back up while I was unpacking. He must have slipped in while I was staring out the window or in the bathroom and crawled into the storage space. He was waiting for me to fall asleep. I slowly sat up, making the bed creak intentionally. I yawned loud enough for him to hear. I swung my legs over the edge, making sure my feet hit the floor away from the cabinet door. I mumbled something to myself about needing water, trying to act like I was just thirsty. I walked heavily across the floor to the table. I grabbed my headlamp and my car keys. I didn't even look at the bunk. I walked to the trapdoor. I undid the deadbolt loudly. I paused for a second, terrified that the cabinet door would burst open behind me. I heard a soft click from the bunk, the sound of a latch opening. I threw the trapdoor up and practically jumped down the steep stairs. I heard the cabinet door slam against the wall above me and heavy footsteps hit the floorboards of the cabin. I hit the dirt trail and sprinted. I ran down those switchbacks in the dark, risking a broken ankle with every step. I ran until my chest felt like it was going to explode. I didn't see a flashlight behind me, but I didn't stop until I saw my car. I drove to the nearest town and found a sheriff's station. It was closed, but I used the emergency phone outside. They sent a deputy up there the next morning. He said the tower was empty, but the storage compartment under the bunk was filled with trash. They never found him. The woods are too big and he knew them too well. But I know he was lying right there under me, listening to my heartbeat, just waiting for me to close my eyes.